Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Welcome to the Mass TLC Professional Women's Community Meeting. Today, we're going to be talking about a very important topic, the imposter syndrome, what it is, and how to conquer it. A little bit about Mass TLC. This is our professional women's group, and we have people within the community in all kinds of roles, from talent to technical. All are welcome to participate and share in how to help women progress in their careers. I also would like to say in this meeting, we're going to have, different interactions. We'll have polling, and we encourage you to chat your comments every few minutes. The presenters will ask, what questions are there, and I will jump in and voice your questions. I want to say thank you to our community sponsors, Cyber Reason and Nuance, and also to our global sponsors who help programs like this all year long. And now I'd like to introduce Kim Meninger and Sara Faatz. Sorry, Sara. Yes, I'd like to introduce them. Kim, please take over.
Yeah, thank you, Nayla. I am really excited to be here today. My name is Kim Meninger. I am a women's leadership coach, and I specialize in helping women to build confidence, visibility, and influence so you can maximize your impact and advance to higher levels of leadership. And because I have such a strong emphasis on confidence, imposter syndrome is a very common theme that I see and that I have experienced firsthand. It may sound funny to say this is my favorite topic to discuss, but it really is. And a lot of that stems from my own personal experience, which we'll talk about as we move forward. We want to keep this as interactive and engaging as possible. So we, as Nayla mentioned, invite you to share your own questions, your own comments with us as we move forward. Before we jump in, I will share some slides just to set the stage for what we're talking about. Just give you a little bit more background on imposter syndrome, how it shows up. And then, but before we even do that, I'd like to start with a quick poll. So Mackenzie, do you mind sharing the poll right now before we jump into the slides? Great. So just want to take a quick pulse and see how familiar you are with imposter syndrome. So please take a moment to respond to the poll on your screen.
And Kim, I have to agree with you. This is one of my favorite topics as well. It's clearly something that I think, whether people have identified it or not, it's something that almost everyone experiences at some point or another. And it's as you dive deeper into it, it's definitely very interesting, and there are so many different ways, and I know we'll talk about that today, but to overcome it. So I'm excited about our conversation.
I am too. Great. Okay. So if we look at the results here, it looks like the majority of you are aware of it, but don't fully understand it. Some of you are not familiar at all, and some of you know all about imposter syndrome. So this is great. I think hopefully by the time you leave here, you'll have a much better understanding of imposter syndrome. And most importantly, we want to share some strategies with you so that when you do leave here and unfortunately, as Sara said, most of us will experience this at some point or another. So when you leave here, you'll have tools and strategies to address it more confidently. So I'm going to share my screen now. And as I mentioned, to talk a little bit about what imposter syndrome means. And let me just get this here. Can you see that okay, Sara?
Yeah, that looks perfect. Yep.
All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some statements with you. And as I'm talking, I want you to reflect and think about whether these statements resonate with you now or at some point. Now, the thing about imposter syndrome is that it's not necessarily consistent, right? We may experience it for extended periods of time in certain situations, but it's usually episodic. It ebbs and flows. So it may not be the case that you're experiencing it today, but you may recognize it from other parts of your career or even back when you were in school. So just take a moment to think about whether or not these statements sound like you. So the first statement is, I attribute my success to luck or timing rather than my own skills and talents. I worry that others will find out that I'm not as competent or capable as they think I am. I've unknowingly deceived people into thinking I'm good enough for this job. I feel undeserving of my success At any moment, I may be exposed as a fraud. So these are sort of classic statements or symptoms, shall we say, of imposter syndrome. And again, they may not be real for you now, but they may have come up at some point in your life. And it's important to be able to recognize them so that if it does come up again, you can know what it is and name it. And that in and of itself is going to have a powerful effect on diluting it and allowing you to manage it more effectively. So I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about what we mean by imposter syndrome. Now, imposter syndrome is a term that was coined by a couple of psychologists in the late 1970s. They actually started by calling it the imposter phenomenon. And the term is used to describe those feelings of self-doubt and inadequacy that we might feel despite contradictory evidence. So on paper, to the outside world, we're doing great, but inside we feel like a fraud. The interesting thing about imposter syndrome is that it's most common among high achievers. So it's the people that you would least expect to experience it who actually experience it the most. And if we tie that into the third point here about the fact that it commonly occurs at points of transition when we're learning something new, stepping outside of our comfort zones, it actually makes sense that it's the high achievers who experience this more than others, because it's high achievers that are always pushing themselves forward, always taking on new challenges, expanding their horizons. And so anytime you do that, you put yourself at risk for feeling that sense of, uh-oh, what have I done, right? I don't know if I can actually do this. Interestingly, when the initial studies were first done, and all subsequent studies up until very recently all focused on women. So the consensus was, or the general sense was, that this was only something that affected women. But more recent studies have shown that it affects men as well. And I'll just add to that, about the research shows that about 70% of the population will experience this at one point or another. What does it look like? I want to just share some of the manifestations of imposter syndrome, again, so that you can recognize it in yourself as you move forward. Imposter syndrome, it comes with a lot of anxiety. And so there's often this cycle that happens, and I'll just paint what might be a familiar scenario to some of you. It certainly is for me. This has been a lot of my own personal experience with imposter syndrome, is that you've done really well in the past. Things, again, on the surface are going really well. Let's imagine that you have a presentation to give next week. So in your mind, you're thinking to yourself, I really have to prepare for this one because this is going to be the time when I blow it, right? Even though all those times when I've been successful in the past, those don't matter. That was a fluke, that was luck. I was in the right place at the right time. Going forward, this is going to be the one, right, that ruins me. And so I'm going to put all of my energy into this. I'm going to stay up late. I'm going to worry about it. And then the day comes, I give the presentation, get great feedback. Everybody tells me that it was wonderful. I take a deep breath. Phew, that was a relief. And then on to the next, right? Now, the next one is going to be the one, right? So we get temporary relief from doing well in the moment, but then we don't learn from that. We don't internalize that feedback or that experience. Perfectionism is highly correlated with imposter syndrome, and the unfortunate part of perfectionism is that we often apply perfectionism across the board. So there are times when good enough is good enough, right? And we don't tend to, as imposter syndrome sufferers, see the world that way. We want everything to be perfect, and we set these really unrealistic standards for ourselves so that we always feel like we're falling behind. We're always disappointing ourselves. I mentioned the unwillingness to internalize positive feedback. The interesting thing about those of us who struggle with imposter syndrome is that we need that feedback. We need to hear from you that we did well, but once you tell us that, we're not going to believe you, right? No, you're just saying that. No, you missed the part where I messed up, right? And so there's just this constant sense that we got here, again, by some fluke and not because of our own strengths and successes. There's, interestingly, a fear of failure on the part of a lot of people who struggle with imposter syndrome. Most of us recognize intellectually that we're not going to get through this life without failure in some way, but those of us with imposter syndrome, really feel like there's a lot of shame that comes with failure. And so we do everything we can to avoid it. And alternatively, there's a fear of success, which is also interesting. And some of this comes from knowing that as we move forward, the expectations are going to increase, the pressure is going to increase. And so we're afraid of taking that next step because of what that will mean for our anxiety and for that self-doubt. I have also heard anecdotally from people, women in particular, who are afraid to be more successful than their partners because of what they fear that might do to the dynamic. And I actually recently spoke with a man who told me that he experiences imposter syndrome because he grew up in a blue-collar family where his father did, manual labor to support the family. He worked really long hours. He had to make a lot of sacrifices to support the family. He's now a VP of software engineering. He feels like he gets paid way more than he deserves and really holds himself to that standard that his father set. He thinks, yeah, I'm a fraud, right? My dad, he worked really hard and I don't deserve to be in this position. I don't deserve to be making the kind of money that I make. And then finally, before we move into the conversation, I want to make a point about why this is such an important topic for us to have. Now, you might wonder if people with imposter syndrome are the high achievers, right? The people who are most likely to be successful, the people you least expect to have self-doubt, why it's important to have this conversation. And the reality is that imposter syndrome has significant effects at both an individual and an organizational level. At an individual level, and some of you may relate to this because of your own experience, when you think about the anxiety that comes from always worrying, am I doing this right? Do I belong in this role? Are people going to find out that I don't know what I'm doing? That takes a toll on us physically and emotionally. We might not be eating as well. We may not be exercising, sleeping well, because we're taking so much time, again, to perfect things that are already good enough or worrying about our performance. We may not have the adequate professional relationships we need to achieve our goals, because if you don't believe that you're in the right role, if you doubt that you have the right skills or value to contribute, you're not going to go out there and start building relationships with influencers, with strategic people who can help guide you through your career. That's all going to lead to reduced professional satisfaction and motivation. How motivating is it to get out of bed every day if you're worried that you're going to be exposed, right? And then, of course, that risks that we don't reach our full potential. Maybe we hold back from raising our hands for new opportunities or applying for new roles because we don't really believe that we belong there. Now, we often tend to think of imposter syndrome as an individual issue. And because it's hard to measure and quantify, it makes us uncomfortable to talk about in a business environment. We see that as fluffy, right? We don't really consider it at more of a macro level. But the reality is that there's a significant organizational impact as well. I mentioned earlier that 70% of the population will experience imposter syndrome at some point in their lives, right? Imagine what that means for your business. If you've got a significant portion of your employee base who are questioning whether they're in the right role, who are hesitating to speak up, to share an idea because they feel like they're going to look foolish, right? Or interacting with your customer base in less than optimal ways because they're doubting themselves, right? That has a significant impact on your ability to innovate, on your ability to get new ideas and be creative, to build the kinds of relationships in the community that you want to have. It can also result in higher healthcare costs. I talked about the physical and emotional consequences of this, right? That's going to have an effect on the health and well-being of your employees. It's also going to lead to decreased productivity because so much of our attention is paid to what we think we don't know. And again, avoiding failure. So you're not engaging in the kinds of productive conversations that are needed to move the business forward. And a smaller talent pipeline. If people are feeling like they're not qualified for the next step, despite all evidence to the contrary, right, you're going to have a smaller pool of people to choose from. So I think it's really important that we recognize that this is a topic that's worthy of our attention, both from an individual perspective as well as from an organizational perspective. And what I'd like to do now, as we transition into the conversation around this imposter syndrome and how we experience it, is to do our next poll question. So Mackenzie, if you don't mind putting up that next poll, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
So Kim, I think it's interesting, you know, you had mentioned that imposter syndrome impacts men and women both. I know you and I share a favorite quote from a gentleman named Albert Einstein. Believe it or not, for those of you in the audience who haven't heard it, he said right before he passed away, "The exaggerated esteem in which my life work is held makes me very ill at ease. I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler." So think about that for a moment, right? I mean, Albert Einstein thought of
Exactly.
himself as an imposter.
That's a perfect example of, you know, the people we least expect, right? Who would ever expect that Albert Einstein would experience self-doubt, right? But if he can experience it, it's no wonder that we do too.
Right, absolutely.
So thank you all for sharing. It looks like, again, the vast majority of you are somewhere in the middle. You find it bothersome, but manageable. There's, you know, an unfortunate 37% of you who find it very disruptive. And then congratulations to the 4% of you who aren't experiencing it, perhaps again now, but might in the future. And so, you know, whether it's something that you're finding manageable today or haven't encountered yet, it's really important, again, to know what you're potentially up against and to have the skills and tools that are going to help you to manage it and to navigate it more effectively. And so I'm really excited to now more formally bring you into the conversation. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your experience with imposter syndrome?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Sara Faatz, and I lead the developer relations team here at Progress. And this, as I mentioned earlier, is also a favorite topic of mine, and I have spoken on it a number of times. For me, I think, you know, the one story I always go back to, Kim, and I know that we've talked about this already, but one of my earliest memories of being inflicted with the imposter syndrome was shortly after college. It was when the internet was booming, and there were so many, you know, you talk about stretch opportunities. We were all in these roles as the internet is booming that were, I mean, it was incredibly geeky and so fun and so many opportunities. And I was working for a technical PR agency, and one of my clients was on the networking side of the house. And we would go into meetings and I would sit there quietly during the whole meeting and I wouldn't say a word. And then my boss, Bridget, and I would walk from the client's office back to our office, I would just unload on her. And I would be like, "Oh, we should do this and we should have done this." And when they said that, she stopped me one day and she's like, "Why are you telling me this?" She's like, "Why don't you open your mouth in the meetings?" And I was kind of taken aback. And I said, "Well, what if I'm wrong?" You know, I was so afraid that they were going to think that I was an idiot, you know, and that I didn't belong there, and that I understood the technology, I understood what we were doing. And her response to me was perfect. She said, "If you're wrong, you're wrong." She said, "But if you don't ever open your mouth, you're never going to be right either." And it took for me having that person who I felt I was comfortable feeling vulnerable with, being able to say to her all of the things that I had shared and then share with her my fear, but then also have her give me that kind of tough love, which is stop telling me, stop talking to me, open your mouth and share with the world. And so from that point on, I did. And I wasn't always right, but I never regretted the contributions that I was making. You know, so that's, you know, again, I know we all have stories, but that's probably for me the one that sticks out the most and was probably the most defining in my career.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Sarah. And I know that this can be an uncomfortable topic for many. And one of the reasons we're having this conversation and why I think Sarah and I talked about it being one of our favorite conversations is because we want to normalize this. We want to get rid of the shame and the stigma that comes with feeling this way, right? This is just a very normal human response to the discomfort and uncertainty that we navigate in our workplaces and in our lives more broadly. So I want to encourage all of you to use this moment as a chance to take a risk, share your own story, share your questions. This is a safe space. And the more comfortable we can get talking about our own stories, the more we can set the example for others too. We give permission to others to share their stories when we share our own. So if you're a leader within your organization and you're putting on a brave face and never exposing your vulnerability, right? What message are you sending to the other people on your team that it's not safe to be vulnerable, to have self-doubt, and that just has its own set of consequences, as we've talked about. So I want to share my personal story with imposter syndrome as well. Similar to yours, and I think you and I are contemporaries, Sarah. I also started my career at the kind of the peak of the dot-com boom, and I had studied psychology as an undergrad. And from the time I was, a child and old enough to know what it meant, I always wanted to become a psychologist. Never doubted that. Overloaded on psych courses in college. That was my master plan. But when I decided at one point not to go into a PhD program, it just wasn't the right time in my life. I couldn't imagine myself spending 5 years in school again. I had this opportunity to go work for a tech company. I had a family friend who brought me in, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that my psychology skills actually served me well. The soft skills allowed me to grow my career pretty quickly, but I got promoted into this position where I was a relationship manager and was constantly surrounded by engineers. I was in an organization where I was managing partners with software vendors that were integrating their software with to be able to manage our hardware. And I would sit in these meetings with engineers, and I felt like they were speaking a foreign language. I remember I was thinking to myself, I'm one question away from this whole house of cards just crumbling. Right? Everyone's going to figure out I don't belong here. I have no idea what I'm doing. And I can remember the anxiety got so high that I just decided, and I think this is something that a lot of us as women do too, right? Is we want the definitive textbook. We want like what's the study and memorize that's going to help me through this. And I remember thinking, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll just go get a master's in software engineering. Simple enough, right?
Of course. 3
courses in software engineering before I realized I'm not so sure this is the right answer either. And we'll talk more about strategies in a moment, but I have to say this was a turning point for me because I went once I realized I wasn't going to go through a master's program, I went to speak to our executive vice president who oversaw all of engineering. He and I were both BC grads, so I used that as a connection point. And I said to him, sometimes I feel in over my head in these technical conversations. Do you think I should get an engineering degree if I want to advance within the organization? And he looked at me like I had 2 heads and he said, he's like, if you want to go back to school, get an MBA, don't get an engineering degree. He's like, you're surrounded by engineers. If you need to have a technical conversation, bring a technical person into the room with you. He said, you don't need to know everything. You just need to know what you don't know and then build relationships with the people who have that experience. And it was the most liberating conversation for me because what I realized was I wasn't hired to be an engineer. Nowhere on my resume did it indicate that I had any kind of technical expertise. They hired me anyway. And so what I could bring to the table were things that the engineers couldn't do. And I was so focused on what I didn't know and on the expertise that I wasn't there to offer, that I wasn't seeing my own strengths.
And when you think about that, and you touched on it in your slides, the perfectionism, right? For people who are overachievers and have that perfectionism, that is a hard thing to overcome. Are people going to view me as, do I know enough, right? Am I ever going to know enough? And that's, as you mentioned, that's an impossible feat. We're never going to know everything, and we should always strive to be lifelong learners. And when you own that and accept that, and like you also mentioned before, being vulnerable, right? Being able to have that vulnerability as you're experiencing that is truly an important aspect to trying to overcome it.
Absolutely. And I think I was probably just too young and naive to think about the risks of telling the executive vice president that I was by the conversations. But I do think that in hindsight, I'm really grateful that I did, because saying that out loud, first of all, anytime you say something out loud, right, it dilutes the power of it. It's not as scary once we put it out into the world. And then it also allowed me to get help. It allowed me to get, his viewpoint and a different way of thinking about things. So there are real benefits to the vulnerability that we're talking about.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Does anybody in the audience have a story to share? Anything that you're willing to share with us? I do see a question here that I'll answer as you're thinking on hopefully typing, right? Which is, how is imposter syndrome different from self-doubt? And I think that's a really good question. And I'd be curious to hear your response to this too, Sarah. My response is really self-doubt is a symptom, so to speak, of imposter syndrome. But imposter syndrome is deeper than that. And it often is tied to our self-worth and to our sense that I have a right to be here, right? I belong here. I have the ability to be successful in my role. And so self-doubt can be more fleeting. It's also something that, we don't necessarily tie to, again, how we see ourselves more holistically. It's like, oh yeah, well, I have a little bit of self-doubt in this situation, but maybe I can, go out and learn something or get some help, and it's a little bit more manageable. But I'd love to hear your thoughts too, Sarah.
Oh, no, I would agree with that 100%. I think when you start talking about imposter syndrome, self-doubt can be compartmentalized. Imposter syndrome, as you mentioned before, when you're experiencing it, it tends to spill over into so many other things, right? And it takes over your life in a way, maybe that's an exaggeration, but it does to a certain extent, right? And as you talked about, it impacts your willingness to innovate and your creativity. And so with self-doubt, there's a chance. With imposter syndrome, you have to really truly identify what you're experiencing and what you're fearing, and address that head on.
Absolutely. And I see someone here. Thank you so much for saying that you have a story to share. I'm not sure if we have a way to bring you on to tell your story. I don't know, Mackenzie or Nayla, if there's a way to do that in this mode, or if we would just invite you to share a little bit in the chat itself, and we're happy to read it out loud.
Yeah, so I actually, this is Mackenzie. I can unmute Suki if she'd like, or she or he, sorry, would like to share their story. So I can go ahead and do that.
Oh, great.
Fantastic.
And it looks like they're still just self-muted. So if they want to unmute and share, they're welcome to.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Suki.
How are you?
Hi, thank you for unmuting me. I do have a story to tell. So I used to work for a company named Menninger. I now work for Salesforce as part of an acquisition. And that happened, I would say 4 to 5 years ago now. I remember when we were initially acquired, Menninger was not a company with a lot of customers that used the Salesforce platform. And so when we were acquired and we had to do a lot of integration, I actually didn't know a lot about the Salesforce platform. And so naturally, I already felt like an imposter, right? Because we were being acquired, we were being integrated. I was managing, and I built my own team, my IT application solution team from scratch. So you think that I would have a lot of confidence going in, and yet here we are, we got acquired. I felt like an imposter. And at one of the acquisition meetings, someone on the acquisition team literally said in an open meeting with all my team members on the call, she said, "Suki, you know nothing about the Salesforce platform, do you?"
Mm.
And I was like, oh my God, first of all, I couldn't believe someone say that in front of all my team members. And of course, when you're feeling the imposter syndrome, you kind of feel like they're pointing out the truth. And all of a sudden, you're not quite sure what to do. And I remember thinking to myself, this is the moment. I cannot let it go. If I let it go, I'm acknowledging the fact that I don't know what I'm doing and that maybe I'm adding no value. And I felt like time just kind of stopped at that point. And I was thinking to myself that, but I am offering value. I'm doing all the other things that people cannot do. But what do I say to make this moment worth something? And there was so much pressure at the time. And I finally decided to say, and I could hear my voice shaking at the time. I said, that's not very nice to say. And if anyone have any questions in an open meeting, no one should be ashamed to ever ask the question, and no one should be judged. I understand I don't know everything about the Salesforce platform, but at the same time, you know nothing about Menninger either, and that's why we're here. But it was like you said, it's keeping in mind what you're there to offer and really hone in on that, even though you feel so much like an imposter. And I swear that moment I felt so small, but that's my story.
Thank you for sharing that, Suki. I'm really sorry that you had to go through that, but I think that when we find ourselves in those situations too, like you're describing, especially when it's in a public forum, right? It feels like someone reached in and found our weakest point, right? And it just reinforces what we're already feeling, and it's just such a terrible feeling. But the thing that I always think about is, you weren't born with Salesforce expertise. Nobody was born with the skills and knowledge that we have today. Everything was new once. It's not about what we don't know. It's about leveraging the resourcefulness, the resilience, the capabilities that we have going forward, and reminding ourselves that while this particular situation may feel different or new because of its own circumstances, I've been here plenty of times. I've been the new person plenty of times. I've had to learn things plenty of times, right? Keeping it in perspective.
Absolutely. I'm reminded too of a time I had a woman who was working for me, and she was about 10 years younger than I am at the time. She was about just out of college. And we were giving her stretch goals, and I think, and stretch assignments, right? There were a lot of things. She was being pushed out of her comfort zone, left, right, and center, which is what Suki had just mentioned, and some of the things that you've talked about, Kim, as far as triggers. And she called me one night and just was in tears. And she said, maybe I'm not cut out for this. And I stopped her and I said, I wouldn't have hired you if I didn't think you were cut out for it. I said, but you have to believe that. You have to look inside and find that. I said, but I wouldn't have asked you to do this task, this job, and there were things we needed to do to look back because she was feeling so overwhelmed and stressed. How could we change the task so that it was, but I always think about that, and I still to this day have nothing but confidence in her. And so being able to, for her to be able to say that to me, for me to be able to say that to her, and then for her to go back and look in, how do I find that? And I think we all have that person or those people who we can have that sounding board relationship with. But again, it's those triggers, right? Those transition points that for her and for Suki, for actually everything we've talked about today, these are new environments, new situations, new scenarios where we are being stretched.
Absolutely.
I'm going to jump in there. We have 2 or 3 stories in the chat. Is this a good time for me to read it?
Yes, please do.
Right. These are just amazing, you guys. Thank you for putting yourselves out there. I'm just going to go with the first story in the chat by Priyanka Tawari. She has a story to share. She was promoted very early in her career and was the youngest among her peers. When she got, I'm just going to read it in her words. When I got to my own office, that's when the imposter syndrome hit. I went through a phase of feeling that I didn't deserve it and that they will take away from the title and office. It took a good 6 months period to get comfortable. Deep down, I knew that I was qualified for the promotion, but it took very long to accept the recognition. Let me read a couple more maybe, and you can address them, Priyanka also had a great question, which is, how is imposter syndrome different than self-doubt? I think you read that one. I want to read another story by Nicole Goldstein. My story, I'm so worried about looking strong and professional and capable that I overcommit myself and also allow myself to be walked on to some degree. I feel like any sort of sign of weakness will fold the precarious castle of cards I've built.
Yeah, thank you.
And you want to go ahead and address, and then I'll read the next 2?
Sure. Oh, thank you all for being so brave and courageous and sharing your stories. I think, what Sarah and I, you can see us here nodding our heads because it's very familiar stories to us. And I don't mean to minimize the individual pain that goes with them, but I mean, I think we can all relate to what you're describing. And speaking of the triggers, we talked about the fact that when you're in a time of transition, when you're taking on new responsibilities, stretching yourself outside of your comfort zone, it's a very common response. Another common trigger of imposter syndrome is feeling different from the people around you. So this is a really important point as we talk here as a women's community. So if you're the one of few or the only woman in your male-dominated organization, you're more likely to experience imposter syndrome. If you are a person of color, if you are somebody who has a different personality style, maybe you're an introvert in a room full of extroverts. I think it was Priyanka mentioned being the youngest, right? That was definitely my experience too. I was the youngest. I was often the only woman. We tend to look around, we see people who are different from us, and we think, what's wrong with me? Right? Why am I not more like them? And that can trigger a lot of self-doubt. So, you know, we'll talk more about strategies in a moment, but I think that's an important thing to recognize too when you think about your own experience. And it goes back to what Suki was saying too, of like when someone calls you on it, you are already in that heightened state of I don't belong here, I'm worried, and then someone kind of puts you on the spot and calls attention to that weakness, that the overwhelming discomfort that comes with that.
I've heard a number of women, Kim, say, especially in the tech industry, well, I was only asked to speak because I'm a woman, or I was only asked to do it because I'm a woman. And I think that's a really, that's something we all need to get away from, right? I think that that you wouldn't be asked if you weren't qualified. But I think that's a very common go-to for people with imposter syndrome.
Well, and I've heard too from women who have told me that they've been told by their managers that they are like they were hired as a diversity candidate, and wow, they've told me, I don't know what to do with that, right? Are you telling me that I am less legitimate because of that? Like, how am I supposed to interpret that information? And it automatically puts them in a position of self-doubt.
Yep.
Nayla, do you jump in? It
yes,
looks like we have great contributions here.
Again, my heart is warm with these stories. Another one, and I won't mention your names unless you want me to. So this particular attendee this is her story in her words. I got accepted to Harvard Business School, and once I got there, didn't feel I belonged. Didn't have as much to add to the classroom conversation. I was intimidated and became very anxious. So I barely raised my hand the whole first semester and got warnings midway through. I had to then force myself to speak up and take the risk of being wrong because the fear of failing out was stronger than the fear of speaking up. And the more I spoke up, the better I felt. I made it through that semester and successfully finished to get my MBA. I still have felt it from time to time in various jobs, but as I've gotten older, I've become more accepting of myself.
I love that story, and I want to call out a couple things here. Number one is that it was more important to you to take the risk of doing something that made you uncomfortable than the alternative, right? And in this case, you kind of had two negative things that you were looking at, but I think one of the strategies for managing imposter syndrome is to really understand what's more important to you than fear. Right? What's more important to you in this situation than the fear of what you will lose? And it could be just tying it to your personal values. It's more important to me to show up in integrity. It's more important to me to be of service to my team. You know, and that's going to help you get through the fear that's going to keep you back. Right? The other thing that I love about this story is that you built a muscle by doing that, right? You took a risk and it got easier, because in the beginning, the first step is always the hardest, right? And as you started to do it, you realized I can do this, and you got into it, and it served you well. So I thank you for sharing that.
I'm going to go to, and yes, Bobby Carlton, I'm going to say hello out there. She has a question, and it was early on. So before we get to the next story or two, Bobby's question is, she just said hi, women get demerits for bragging more than men, and some women are cautious about asking questions or offering comments out of abundance of caution. Can you address this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'll just share some initial thoughts and then feel free to jump in, Sarah. So, you know, a lot of the reason why we experience self-doubt in the workplace is because we've been conditioned to fear the backlash that we experience more so than men, right? This is not all internally driven. There are times when we've been given negative feedback, criticized in some way, and that stays with us. And we carry it with us to other workplaces, other managers. And so it's kind of that once bitten, twice shy scenario. Here's how I think about the whole idea of self-promotion when it comes to women. We don't, generally speaking, like self-promotion. We don't like to promote our strengths. We don't like to talk about ourselves in that way. And again, a lot of that is because we were taught that it's not okay to do that. I always think about self-promotion through the lens of service. And I think this is an opportunity that we as women have to do this authentically, to minimize the backlash, and to really serve ourselves and others in more meaningful ways. I think that self-promotion, when you do it strategically, is a service to others, because you were hired into your organization because of your unique set of skills, strengths, experience, perspectives, everything that you bring. And if you don't share that with the people around you, you deprive them of an opportunity to leverage that experience. Imagine that you walk into the room, you know the answer to the problem, and they're all sitting there trying to solve it. You're holding back because you don't want to brag, but you just now made everybody else's job harder, right? So I think we always worry about, oh, am I going to come across as obnoxious and self-serving? If you have that self-awareness, you're far less likely to come across that way, right? It's the people without the self-awareness that do that. Instead, ask, how can I help? How can I be of service? How can I bring my skills to the organization more broadly, more prominently to the surface? And in the process, I get credit for that. I get seen as somebody who has more capabilities, more influence, but I also, again, minimize the backlash that comes with more, quote unquote, obnoxious self-promotional behavior. But Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I know, I would agree. Actually, the phrase that came to mind as you were talking was self-awareness, and you said it, but I think it's self-awareness. It's also situational awareness, right? So there are, as you mentioned, there is a way to position your expertise or your contribution as service, but you have to be aware of the situation, right? So if you just go in and like a bull in a china shop, and that might not be the right tactic. Maybe it is, depends on the situation, right? So understanding the being self-aware and situationally aware, I think that's how you can overcome and tackle that. And that goes back to, some of our ways to manage these bouts, right?
Absolutely. And I just want to make a comment here too, because I see a comment that says, I wish my unique skills had value, and I don't have enough context to better understand where that's coming from. But I think it's symbolic of how many of us feel, especially as women, for the reasons that I just mentioned. We're taught from a very young age to be humble, not to brag, that it's not socially acceptable for us to talk about ourselves individualistically, that we put other people first. And so it's really hard for us to be connected to our strengths, to even have the self-awareness to recognize that what we do is special. We're so tuned into the people around us. I mentioned in my own story, I was so, marveling all the time at the expertise of the people around me and never paying attention to what I had to offer. And I really, truly believe that is one of the most important strategies for managing imposter syndrome, is to take time to understand what your strengths are and the value that you have to offer. And I know that it's probably not something, I often, joke half-heartedly that if I asked each one of you today, what's your greatest weakness, you'd be able to tell me right off the top of your head, right? But if I say, what's your greatest strength, you're likely going to pause, either because A, you don't know, or B, you don't feel comfortable telling me because it feels somehow inappropriate to talk about yourself that way, right? So we have to, I always say, we owe it to ourselves. Like, it's great to have, you mentioned this earlier, Sarah, right? It's great that we focus on continuous learning. Of course, we're always going to have things that we can do better, growth opportunities. That's important. But we owe it to ourselves to balance that with an unapologetic acceptance of the fact that we already have strengths. Not a single one of you would be in this conversation right now if you didn't have strengths, right? And there's nothing shameful about that. That's the service we have to offer to the world, to our organizations, to our communities, right? So one strategy that I would say that any one of you can adopt immediately is to keep an accomplishments journal. Write down at the end of every day, don't go more than a week, but at the end of every day or every week, what you're celebrating, problems that you've solved, things you've checked off your to-do list. Don't attach value to them, just write them all down. And what you're going to find is this has multiple benefits. From a practical standpoint, it's going to be much easier for you to write your resume, do your performance review, all of the things, trying to remember what you did 6 months ago. It just doesn't work. It's also going to be a great confidence boost when you find yourself in the situation of feeling like I have nothing to offer, I'm a fraud, right? To go back through this, there's only so much you can chalk up to luck. When you've got a record of things that you're doing, and especially you're looking at it from the outside, you're going to realize pretty quickly, actually, I'm doing a lot more than I thought I was. And what's really important about this is it's just like a gratitude practice, right? When you have a gratitude journal and you write down every day what you're grateful for, you literally train your brain to scan the environment for the good instead of the bad. When you're writing down everything you're doing well every day, you are training your brain to think about yourself from a position of strength as opposed to from a position of weakness.
Absolutely. I like to say celebrate success, but don't think of success as these massive things. Our success and everything in our life is made up of small moments, and you have, the big lighthouse moments peppered in. Take time to celebrate those small things, right? And talk about those small, what you in your mind consider small accomplishments, because even the smallest accomplishment is still an accomplishment, right? And as you said, if you're looking at that from the lens, retrospectively, you do realize how much went into that. And I think we, especially if you are experiencing imposter syndrome, have a tendency to say that wasn't really that big of a deal. And really, when you write it down and look at it, you can say, oh, wait a minute, maybe that was, and really recognize it. I think the other thing to think about too, we've talked a lot about being vulnerable, and I think it's very easy to say. I think sometimes it's hard to start that process, and I have, the way I've tackled that has been to have I have a close group of friends, and they don't actually all know each other, and they aren't all in the same group. Some are family, some are not. People I feel comfortable being vulnerable with. And so when you start in a safe space, start with people that way, you find it's easier to be vulnerable outside of that core group, right? So if that's a concern for you right now, how do I let people know maybe I don't know everything? Start with people you do know. Start with the people you know who are going to love you and care about you no matter what. I have one of my very close friends. I often professionally will reach out to her and say, am I thinking about this right? I feel like an idiot. And she'll either say, no, you are being an idiot, or she'll say, not in a bad way, or she'll say, yeah, I think you are, but have you thought about this, or have you thought about that? And we use each other as a sounding board. What that does, though, is it allows me to say, oh, okay, wait a minute. It's a reminder to me personally, not that I needed her validation, but it's a reminder to me that I can do this. I can go and be vulnerable outside of her. I can also, and if I'm wrong, again, as my friend's father from the South always says, what are they going to do? Chew you up and spit you out? Probably not, right? It's okay to be wrong sometimes.
Exactly.
Kim,
Yes.
you want me to jump in and say 2 more stories, and then you can take it?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure everyone gets heard as promised, or as many can get heard. This particular attendee, I'm a software engineer with a master's degree, worked more than 10 years in the same role, never being promoted and unwilling to advocate for myself. Her VP said, good for you, do it for yourself. Later, I was fearful of walking away. Outside of my day job, I have tremendous experience in relationship building and sales, finding partners for my favorite nonprofit as radio host. I have felt like an imposter, uneasy with presenting myself because I have so much to offer and told my background intimidating. Think about that. Let me slide down and tell another one. Here's one from another attendee. I'm the oldest who started later in life. Being older than the rest made me work harder among male-dominated software professionals. I have now completed my information systems degree at Harvard and did quite well. I feel that jobs should be given to the right candidates irrespective of age. Sometimes women undersell themselves, just like you mentioned. Don't want to brag, self-promote, show off.
Yeah, and once again, I just want to thank everybody who's bravely sharing your story right now. I mean, this is really hard to do, and you're not only, it's not only good for you, but it's good for all of us to hear these stories and remind ourselves we're not alone, that we're all feeling this for different reasons, and we're all in different situations. We all reflect different demographics, right? And so one of the other triggers of imposter syndrome is taking a different path, taking a non-traditional path to where you are. So somebody talked about being older. If you make a transition from one function to another and you look at all your peers and they have all been on one track and yours is a little bit different, you may question your own legitimacy or your own credibility. There's a lot of things that we get in our heads about. And I think part of what has helped me to better understand imposter syndrome and to better manage it is to recognize that when we're hearing that voice that's telling us you're a fraud, you don't belong here, you're not good enough, right? Is that what that voice really is the voice of fear. And the voice of fear is a response by our brains to uncertainty, to something new, to a new challenge. And our brain sees that as danger, and the automatic response, as we all experience in that fight or flight response, is get back into your comfort zone. That voice is not going to be kind and gentle because we wouldn't listen to it if it were. So that voice is designed to be as harsh and as attention getting as possible. And so we have a choice. We can interpret it as reality and and give it credibility, or we could see it for what it is and say, you know what, I call it my overactive bodyguard, right? You know what, I know what you're trying to do here. I really appreciate that you're trying to take care of me right now, but I got this, right? Yes, this is a new situation, but I've been here before. I can use the same kind of skills and resources, right? So again, it comes back to sort of naming it, recognizing what's actually going on, and not getting tangled up in the beliefs or the what seem to be facts that we're telling ourselves. One other thing that I want to share too is one of my favorite stories, going back to both, leveraging your resources, like we talked about early on, about knowing your strengths. A friend of mine told me that about a year ago, her boss called her into his office, and he's not a very good communicator. He didn't really set the stage for this, but he said to her, I'm going to put you on this data analytics project. You're going to work with this team. So she leaves the room and she's thinking to herself, oh my God, what am I going to do? I could barely use Excel. Why are they putting me on a data analytics project, right? So she walks into the room with these data analytics people and she sits down and she says right off the bat, well, clearly I'm the weakest link here, right? And they said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, you're the data analytics experts. What do I have to contribute to this situation or to this project? And they said, well, that's why we're here. But what we need from you is the ability to tell a story, right? We need the additional context. And all of a sudden she's like, oh, thank God, that's something I can do, right? And I think it ties to what I was saying too, of like, we're so aware of other people's expertise.
Right.
Well, because she said that out loud, because she was able to get the validation that she actually does have value to offer, she could come from a position of strength and see where her lane is, right? And I think we carry this around. This speaks to the vulnerability point, right? We carry this around and then we're so ashamed to ask questions about what's expected of me here, or how can I best contribute? And then it just feeds the anxiety and that sense of I don't belong here. But instead, if we all took a moment to, we don't have to say we're the weakest link, but to clarify, right? Like, what's the best way for me to contribute to this project? How can I best leverage my expertise in helping this effort, right? Then we can all come in with the confidence that we know what we're there to do.
Right. It's interesting. You had mentioned weakness. Somebody else had mentioned it in one of their comments. And this is talking more to physical, but I think it's to me, looking back on it now, it makes me laugh because my daughter will be 14 next month. And up until this year, I traveled quite a bit for work. And when I was pregnant with her, my husband said to me as I was getting ready to go on a flight, he says, whatever you do, do not pick that suitcase up over your head and put it in the overhead compartment. I'm like, well, he's like, stop. He's like, I know that you think that you can do this. He said, and physically you can. He said, but it's not healthy for the child, right? And the fact that, and for me for so long, if somebody offered to do that, I felt, no, I can do this. I'm strong. I can, it allowed me to stop and say, just because I'm not, that doesn't mean that I'm not a strong person, right? I'm carrying a child. And it seems so obvious now, right? But it was such a mental block for me. And I did let people lift the suitcase for me for what it's worth. But it's interesting because when you think about weakness, we think about it in so many ways. I felt like I had to be strong in everything I did. I had to be strong at work. I had to be strong physically. I had to be strong. And this goes back to you don't have to be perfect, right? And that there are reasons, and that shouldn't define you, right? So it's an interesting, again, weakness just made me think of that, and it certainly did not mean I was weak by any stretch of the imagination, right? Or less capable.
That's right, and you don't have to do it all yourself, right? That's the thing that most CEOs have figured out, right? They don't have to know everything and do everything. They have a team that does it, right?
Exactly.
So that's part of it too, is recognizing, yeah, well, I could get a software engineering degree, but do I want to spend that? Because all the effort that I put into doing that is taking me away from the things that I do well and that I want to be focused on. So we have to ask ourselves those questions too. Why not find somebody whose joy comes from what you don't like doing or don't know how to do, and partner with each other?
Yep, absolutely.
And so I know that we could spend all day having this conversation, and I'm once again grateful to everybody who chimed in. We do want to do one more poll question, and then I'm going to share some contact information so that you can continue the conversation with us if you'd like. Mackenzie, can you share that final poll with us? All right, so we want to just do a quick pulse and ask if this conversation provided you with some strategies that are going to help you to manage imposter syndrome.
While they're answering that, I think we should share one of our other shared favorite quotes because I think it's just so amazing. Maya Angelou once said, I've written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're going to find out now. I've run a game on everybody and they're going to find me out. So again, I know we've talked ad nauseum about the fact that this impacts so many people, but you know, we started with Einstein and we're ending with Maya Angelou, right? You are definitely in good company if you've experienced this, and you're certainly not alone. Absolutely. I think that's a great way to wrap up here. And for those of you who are still processing, and for the small percentage of you who still need help, we've just scratched the surface here. We've started this conversation, but there are many other resources available. I know Nayla has a set of additional resources that she either has shared or plans to share with the group. And feel free, once again, to continue the conversation with us. I'm going to just share for a moment our contact information. Let me see here, share my screen. Show, okay. Can you see that, Sarah? Am I putting them up? Yep, yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. Yep.
So Sarah and I would both love to stay connected with anybody who's interested in continuing the conversation. You can find us on social media here. We have our Twitter links as well as our LinkedIn accounts up here. So feel free to reach out to us. Continue to tell your stories to each other. It's important to foster an environment, again, whether you're a leader or simply an influential member of your team, but you can set a really positive example by demonstrating vulnerability, acknowledging that anytime someone's new to something, they're likely experiencing this and they're likely not telling you, right? So I think it's really important to just assume that any new person on your team has imposter syndrome and to support them accordingly. And so that's something we can all do, whether we struggle with this or not, is to create greater psychological safety for those around us.
And I will jump in there at the last second and say thank you all for your time. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Sarah, so much for the open conversation. I will definitely send around a wrap up with some of the comments that we were unable to share or get to today. There's some great, strong comments here in the chat, and I'm definitely happy to share that. And please, if you have any questions, want to share more, send my way, send to Kim, send to Sarah, and I will, include that, circulate that with the attendees that were here. So with that, I want to say thank you and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.